Welcome to the WPL Book Drop Podcast. Joining us today is Sheryl McGovern. She is the library's current adult services manager, a quilter with more than 36 unfinished projects, a TV series binge watcher, and a reading addict. Welcome, Sheryl.
Thank you, Becky.
I'm your host, Becky Miller, circulation and marketing assistant, habitual avocado toast consumer, nonfiction fanatic, and library school student at the University of Iowa. So, Sheryl, welcome to the podcast. This is your first time joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do at the library and how you came to take the position that you're currently in?
Sure, I can do that. I would be glad to, and thank you for having me. I retired from the library about 5.5 years ago. I held various positions in a time span of about 33 years, but I retired. And then Nick Rossman, former director, called me for a reference, and I said sure, and then we kind of joked about this pandemic stress dream I had had pretty much every week, where I came back to work at Waterloo, and the building was always different. The staff was sometimes the same, but the thing that remained the same was I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't know where my keys were, and I didn't know how to get in my office. So anyway, we joked about that, and then Nick called me one day and said, hey, you know that dream? And asked if I would be interested in coming back as a temporary public services librarian where I supervise the reference and circulation departments. And I said, yes, I would be honored and excited to do that.
So why did we ask you back, that is?
Well, to make schedules and do things like that. Yeah, Nick left, and then Jillian stepped into his shoes as interim director. And so then someone needed to do Jillian's, at least basic works. I know I'm not doing everything Jillian did, but I am temporarily here until new director is found and everything shakes out that way.
Right, and we are looking for a director right now, so we're starting that process, just getting the ball rolling. So
yes.
You'll be with us for a few months in the interim, so it's kind of nice to have you back. I'm sure that's fun for you, too.
Thank you. It is. It is a lot of fun. This was my favorite position at the library, public services manager. I only had that position about 2 or 3 years, but it was the most fun. So I'm glad to do it again.
Yeah, and right now we're undertaking kind of an interesting move down there in the circulation department. Can you tell our listeners what's going on with the fiction collection?
I can. It's something that was debated for years and years. Previously, we had the mysteries, the science fiction books, and the Western genres all separated out into their own little silos. And over the years, it was discussed about merging them all together and filing them together. The Westerns were taken care of a few years ago, I guess. Now, we are, this week, in the process of putting the mysteries and the science fiction within the regular fiction. We'll still keep the stickers on the books and still have a call number, I believe, for mystery or science fiction, but they'll all be interfiled, so that way it makes it easier to browse if we have an author who writes in more than one genre, or if we've had cataloging changes over the years that separated some series. I think it will be easier for people to browse and find what they're looking for this way.
Yeah, and you did mention this morning that you had come across some series that had been kind of split up before, some had been in mystery and some was in fiction, and so now they're going to be put together again.
All together, yes.
Yeah, so it'll make it easier for people to find those items in the series.
That's the idea.
So the reason that we have you on the podcast today is we're going to talk about books that we've read recently. So can you tell us the first book that you brought today?
I would be glad to. The first book that I brought today is called A Single Thread by Tracy Chevalier. She wrote The Girl with the Pearl Earring a few years back that a lot of book clubs jumped onto. And my book club read this book. And the thing I like about my book club is there are books that I would never have picked up, even though they're good books. But I do because of my book club, and I end up really liking them, which was the case with this book. And it's a story of what was referred to as a surplus woman after World War I in England. There were a lot of women whose fiancés or husbands were killed in the war, and they weren't supposed to be really independent, but yet they were forced into that position. And some of them were happily forced into that position, but they didn't find it easy. So this young woman, Violet, because of her family circumstances, she moved to Winchester, where the cathedral is, and she did not do any embroidery or craft work, but she fell in with a group of very supportive women and helped create the cushions in Winchester Cathedral. Now that's based on, I mean, this is a fictional character, but based on an actual historical happening. Beautiful cushions in that cathedral. And they were made, designed, and then created by this group. As a side story, there's a story about the men who worked in the bell tower and how they practiced and do the chimes. So that was also interesting. So I don't know if this is technically historical fiction, but it is based on some events in history that made it a very good discussion book.
Interesting. So would you say it's like the writing or the characters, or would you say it's plot driven? What is it that you love about the book?
Yes, all of that.
All of
No,
that.
what I like when I look for a good book, I like really good characters. I like a good sense of place. The plot, not so important to me. I mean, it was interesting to hear, to read about these things, but I really like the sense of place. I went and looked up Winchester Cathedral. Of course, I'd heard about it, but I looked for images, and I liked the sense of place. I liked the characters. They were complex characters. You know, nothing was just black and white, lots of shades of gray. There were some ethical dilemmas in this story that really were a hot point of discussion in my group. So.
Good. That kind of reminds me, when you brought up about the sense of place, it reminds me of the autobiography of Malcolm X, which I read a few years ago. And he was talking about when he was younger and he would go out to the clubs and there were all these jazz artists and like Duke Ellington, and how they would tear it up on the dance floor. And I just, at the time, I had to turn on Pandora and just listen to the music while I read the book. So it really put me right there. And so I really agree with you about that sense of place, although I'm a nonfiction person, but that is important to a good story. The one book that, well, I actually brought two books today. The first book that I want to tell you about is called Remember. It's by Lisa Genova. She is the writer of the book Still Alice, which you might have remembered from the movie that Julianne Moore was in.
Yes.
So this is mostly about like the brain and how we process memory. So there's some scientific discussion of what happens when you're processing those memories, where that's happening in the brain, the hippocampus, how memories are stored, and kind of she wants to let people know that certain things you don't have to worry so much about, where you can't find a word, you know, that you're looking for, like, oh, what is that word? Or who was that actor? She said that's very normal. And even as we age, we tend to think, oh, is this a sign of something, you know, younger people, she said, don't have those thoughts because they're like, oh, it's whatever, I'm young, and they don't think about it. But as people get older, it's a natural part of the age process to make it harder. It's harder for your brain to remember certain things. So she wanted to say that, you know, that is very normal. And she talked about where if it's starting to become like this is happening like multiple times a day, then that's when it's a concern. But if it's something that just happens like, oh, I can't remember, you know, what the name of that artist is, it's not such a big thing to be concerned about. And then she also talked about how your memory's altered each time that you pull it up. So your memory is not as clear as you think, because every time you pull that out of the drawer, your brain kind of resaves version 2.0, version 3.0, and it alters things. And it got me thinking about how people go to court and they're witnesses, and they have, you know, this is my memory of the event, but, you know, if you've gone back and replayed that memory several times, maybe it's altered. Maybe there's another person that wasn't there. Your mind can play tricks on you, and we're very open to suggestion as well, she said. So someone can say, don't you remember we found that kitten out back? And you might think, well, no, I don't. But then you start thinking, well, maybe I did. Maybe I do remember a kitten out back. Okay. So we're kind of suggestive in that way. So it's very interesting. I enjoyed it. And that one is called Remember by Lisa Genova. And then you have another one that you want to share.
I do, and now I have another one for my list. I would like to read the Remember book. That's a really interesting topic to me. Now, this Tana French book is part of a series, And I like mystery series. I like literary fiction. I like mystery series, and I like mystery series that are kind of procedural or investigative, very detailed, complex, but also with a little bit of what they call the caper aspect, where they have some quirky, kind of funny characters. I don't want to go through the whole book and not laugh out loud. So I recently discovered Tana French, and I was really shocked I had not known about her, but she writes a series of mystery books set in Dublin, and they're called the Dublin Murder Squad series. She also writes some standalones that are really good too, but I really liked the series. One thing that I was worried about is I like series, and I have since I was a child, where there's a continuing character. I like revisiting those characters. I know their background. I know what's going on in their lives. But this series changes main characters each time, but it's always somebody that you met in one of the previous books, so you know a little bit about them. But anyway, again, these have a great sense of place. They have great characters, very complex. I used to read cozy mysteries. Once in a while I still do, especially during a pandemic. I like something a little lighter, but these books you really can get lost in, lots of detail, and I really enjoyed. Again, I couldn't tell you probably the plot on any of them. I couldn't tell who committed the murder, any of that. But I do remember the characters. I do remember the sense of place. And one thing I wanted to mention about her, which I felt was very appropriate since they're set in Ireland, well, there are the bogs, of course, show up once in a while, but also just a little bit of the mystic. For example, in the first mystery, there was a part that was kind of like, is that a little tiny bit supernatural? Maybe, maybe not. But in each book, there's a little tiny just glimmer of that. Not enough to put you off if you're not a reader of supernatural or it's not really horror, but just a little bit that makes you go, oh, like that. So I liked that.
Interesting. For some of us that don't know, what is a cozy mystery? You mentioned that.
A cozy mystery is another word for it for me is fluff. It's very lighthearted. There's a body in the corner, but nobody really cares. It's all about some fun characters. I'm thinking of Myers. She writes a series of Mennonite mysteries they're set in this nice little bed and breakfast, and sweet characters, fun stuff, and yeah, there is a bad person who murdered somebody, but that's kind of downplayed.
Sure. Okay. So the book the other book that I brought is called Hooked, Food, Free Will, and How the Food Giants Exploit Our Addictions. And this is by Michael Moss. He is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He wrote for the New York Times. So I will be honest with you and tell you, I have not finished this book. I really enjoyed it, but school started back up for me, so I haven't had time. But what it does is it examines the science behind food and why it can be kind of addictive for some of us, in particular salt, sugar, fat, all those things that we really enjoy.
Yes.
Because our brains are programmed to crave those because, before we have this time, we had our caveman time, if you will, and those types of items were good for our energy stores and for us to survive. And so this book kind of delves into what the food industry does as far as like processed foods, how they design their foods to build those cravings that we so often have, and it makes it difficult for us to say, get a box of Girl Scout cookies and have just one cookie rather than a whole sleeve of cookies. So they're meant to be snacky, and the thing about the foods is that they come to our brains so fast. Once they hit our tongue, we can taste the sweetness in a second, or the sense of smell that comes along with all these flavors. Like 80% of our taste comes from smelling. So the food industry is designing all these foods to have wonderful smells, and then of course the taste on that. On top of it, the brain is a little bit like an addict when it comes to food, in the same way that others can be addicts with like a cocaine or a heroin type. So it kind of fires up not the same portions of the brain, but the way your brain reacts to it is just as fast. And that's why food can be a problem for some of us with, addiction. So he just kind of goes into that and just how the food industry designs the foods, knowing that information, trying to make it so that it's hard to resist. And like the Lay's slogan, you can't just have one chip kind of thing. So like I said, I haven't read it all, but I did listen to him talk on NPR about it, and he doesn't come away saying that the food industry is like the tobacco industry, for instance, and they know what they're doing to consumers and that it's this horrible thing. It's more like they're trying to save money and they want to make their foods taste really good, so they put these, extra flavors in there. They had the food scientists make them that way for a purpose, and that's so that they can sell more of their product. And they don't necessarily, they're not trying to push it in the same way that cigarettes are. They just have slowly taken over the food aisles in the supermarket over time. It wasn't so much intentional, according to the documents that he's been able to find. But a really interesting read as far as I've gotten into it, and I do recommend it for that reason, because it's just very interesting. So
Sounds very interesting.
yeah. Well, I think that's all we have today for our books. Sheryl, I want to thank you so much for joining the podcast and talking about the books that you brought today, and then welcoming you back to WPL. It's been great to have you.
Thank you.
So if listeners want to subscribe to the WPL Book Drop podcast, you can do that through the App Store, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.